It was a peaceful morning, just after 11:30 a.m., in the heart of San Antonio when 85-year-old Jack, Jr. Spencer walked into Gracie's diner, just as he had done every Thursday for the past 22 years. The familiar chime of the doorbell barely registered to the bustling lunch crowd, but to a handful of regulars, that soft ring marked the arrival of something steady, something grounded. Jack moved slowly, knees stiff from time and sacrifice, shoulders still squared as if holding onto an invisible rucksack. His khakis were pressed, his boots shined, and the old navy blue cap on his head bore the proud but faded insignia of the 101st Airborne. The world had changed around him, buildings taller, people faster, noise constant. But Jack never rushed. The past had taught him that stillness was sometimes more powerful than motion. He gave a polite nod to the waitress, waved at the cook behind the counter, and took his usual seat in the far-right booth beside the window. Sunlight caught the silver strands in his closely cropped hair, but no one noticed. Except one. 2 tables over, a heavily tattooed man with a long beard and mirrored sunglasses paused his burger mid-bite. He leaned back, sizing Jack up with a smirk, then muttered to his companion just loud enough, "Look at this relic, still pretending like he matters." The comment floated, dismissed by most. Jack didn't flinch. He had been called worse by men who later begged him to carry them off a battlefield. Still, the biker's voice grated. As Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, his planner for local veteran events, the biker let out a chuckle, leaned forward, and sneered. "You think that hat makes you special, old man?" Jack's hands didn't tremble. He set the notebook down gently, lifted his coffee cup, and took a slow sip. His silence was louder than any insult. But the biker didn't stop. The diner seemed to hold its breath as the biker stood up, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor. He adjusted his vest, black leather, patched with skulls, flames, and a crooked American flag, and swaggered toward Jack's table. His boots thudded across the floor like he wanted attention, and he was getting it. Conversations paused. Forks hovered mid-air. People turned, curious, unsure. "You deaf or just slow, Gramps?" the biker asked, towering over the seated man. He slapped a palm flat on the table, sending a tiny tremor through the ceramic coffee cup. Jack looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. Not fearful, not angry, just tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that comes from carrying decades of weight in silence. His gaze met the biker's without blinking. "Go sit down, son," Jack said, voice low and measured. "You're making a fool of yourself." The biker let out a short, ugly laugh. "A fool? I'm not the one wearing a costume pretending I'm still in the war." He reached out and with a flick of the wrist, knocked the navy blue cap off Jack's head. It landed on the floor beside the table, the airborne patch facing upward, like a wounded emblem staring up at the ceiling. Gasps rippled through the diner. The cook stopped mid-flip of a pancake. The waitress nearest the scene froze, eyes wide, not knowing if she should intervene or stay out of it. Jack didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he reached down and picked up the cap, brushing it off with deliberate care. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with age. With memory. He placed the cap back on his head, adjusted it slightly, and looked back up at the man still looming over him. "That's going to be a problem for you," Jack said, voice calm. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth, spoken with the finality of a man who'd survived things the biker couldn't imagine. The biker blinked. Something in that gaze, something ancient and steel-hard, gave him pause. But pride is a loud thing. He scoffed again, turned back toward his table, and muttered under his breath, "Old man's lucky I don't break his other hip." But someone had heard enough. A teenager seated near the door, barely 16, with braces and a ROTC pin on his jacket, stood up. His hands were shaking as he spoke. "That man's a veteran," he said, voice cracking. "He deserves respect. The biker laughed again, louder this time. Respect? For what? Being old and useless? Don't get caught up in fairy tales, kid. The boy's mother grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back into his seat, but the young man held his ground. My brother died in Afghanistan. He wore that same patch. The room fell silent again. A few other patrons nodded. A man near the jukebox pulled back his sleeve, revealing a tattoo of an eagle holding arrows, another veteran. Across the room, a woman in her 60s wiped at her eyes and said quietly, "That's Jack Spencer. He saved my father's life in Vietnam." The biker looked around, suddenly aware of the shift in atmosphere. He was no longer the loudest presence in the room. Jack hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, his cap back where it belonged. The front door opened. A gust of warm Texas air swept in as the sound of engines outside grew louder, unmistakably military. Heads turned toward the windows, where 4 matte green Humvees had pulled up to the curb in a neat line. An unmarked black SUV followed closely behind. Each vehicle bore the faint crest of the U.S. Army. Doors opened simultaneously. Uniformed soldiers stepped out, decorated, composed, purposeful. From the SUV emerged a tall man in dress blues, chest covered in ribbons, his face set in a stony expression that carried the authority of command. Colonel Mark Spencer. He didn't pause to scan the crowd or look around for signs. He already knew exactly where his father would be seated. He walked through the front door with the kind of energy that silenced a room before words were spoken. People stepped aside instinctively. Chairs were scooted in, pathways cleared. The biker, now visibly nervous, shifted uncomfortably as the colonel approached Jack's booth. "Dad," Colonel Spencer said, standing at attention. He offered a sharp salute. Jack stood, slowly, stiffly, and returned it with dignity. His hand shook slightly, but the movement was firm, resolute. "He hit me," Jack said softly, eyes still on his son. "Not hard. But hard enough to make me forget I ever mattered." Colonel Spencer didn't blink. He turned to the biker, now pale beneath his tattoos. "You touch my father?" I didn't mean to," the biker stammered. "It was just a... You slapped the cap off a man who wore that badge when your parents were still in diapers," the colonel said, his voice sharp as steel. "You laid hands on a legacy. On a man who bled for this country before you ever learned to ride a motorcycle." The biker looked down, shame rising in his cheeks like a tide. Jack didn't speak. He simply sat again, took another sip of coffee, and looked out the window as if the matter was already behind him. But the silence in the room was deafening. The colonel stepped closer to the biker. "You're going to pick up your pride from the floor, walk over there, and shake his hand," he said. "Not because he needs it. Because you do." The biker hesitated. Then slowly, like a man approaching a cliff's edge, he stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. He extended a hand. Jack didn't look at it for a long moment. Then, finally, he reached out. His grip was firm, his eyes locked on the biker's. "Remember this," Jack said. "Age is not weakness. And silence is not surrender." The handshake lingered just a second longer than it needed to. Jack's fingers, thick with age and time, closed around the biker's like a vice, not in aggression, but in remembrance. The kind of grasp that conveyed a lifetime, a history, a warning. The biker nodded awkwardly, eyes darting toward the door, and when the colonel gave a subtle nod of dismissal, the man turned on his heel and exited the diner without another word. The room remained quiet for several beats. Then, slowly, something subtle but powerful began to shift. From a booth near the entrance, a gray-haired woman stood and approached Jack's table. She wore a pale green cardigan, a floral dress, and a delicate chain with a gold ring hanging from it. She placed a hand gently on Jack's shoulder. My husband served with you, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Charlie Ames. 3rd Recon. You pulled him out after that ambush in '69. I remember his letters. You were always Spence to them. He made it home because of you. Jack looked up at her, eyes softening, but he didn't interrupt. She continued, he died of cancer 3 years ago. Agent Orange. But he never forgot you. None of them did. Jack nodded solemnly. Charlie was brave. A good man. From another table, a man in a postal uniform stepped forward, hat in hand. You probably don't remember me, sir, but I used to bring mail to the VA center. You were always sitting outside on that bench. Quiet. I just wanted to say, I knew who you were. And I always admired that you never asked for anything. One by one, others approached, people Jack had seen for years but never spoken to. A high school teacher. A firefighter. The manager of the hardware store on Alamo Street. Each one shared a memory, a whisper of Jack's quiet presence. Stories emerged like footprints in the sand, slowly uncovered by the shifting tide of memory. Across the room, the teenager who had first stood up earlier returned with his phone. Sir, he said nervously, my ROTC class, well, we'd be honored if you'd come speak at the school. Just for a few minutes. You don't have to, but, we'd be honored. Jack smiled faintly, then nodded. I'd like that. Colonel Spencer observed it all without interfering. This wasn't his moment, it was his father's. His role was now simply to stand by and witness what should have happened years ago. The colonel eventually stepped outside, taking a call from the base. While he spoke, the soldiers who had accompanied him stood by the vehicles, straight-backed, their presence quiet but undeniable. Locals began to gather near the diner's windows, peeking in. Word was spreading. A few folks even began recording with their phones. Inside, the waitress finally moved. She refilled Jack's coffee, her hands shaking slightly. I never knew, she whispered. Jack looked up at her. Didn't need to, he replied gently. I was just another customer. No, she said, voice steadier now, you were never just that. As the initial flurry of emotion settled, the colonel re-entered. He approached his father's table again, this time more relaxed. Your usual, he asked. Jack raised an eyebrow. You remember what it is? Turkey sandwich, extra mustard, sweet tea with a slice of lemon, the colonel said with a smile. Jack chuckled softly. I'll be damned. I've got a little pull in the kitchen now, the colonel quipped, gesturing toward the cook, who was now preparing the sandwich with meticulous care. The tension that had so recently filled the diner was melting away, replaced with warmth, reverence, and a quiet buzz of conversation. When the food arrived, Jack motioned for his son to sit across from him. The colonel did, carefully removing his cap and placing it beside the napkin holder. For a while, they just sat and ate, like any father and son catching up over lunch. But beneath the surface, something monumental had shifted. For decades, Jack had hidden in plain sight, content to live quietly, never demanding attention for what he had endured. But this day, whether he wanted it or not, had become a turning point. Dad, the colonel said between bites, why didn't you ever tell people who you were? What you did? Jack's eyes didn't lift from his sandwich. What would have changed if I did? Everything, his son replied. Jack shook his head. No. Recognition isn't the same as respect. I didn't want medals. I wanted peace. And I didn't want to relive the parts that took so much from me. The colonel nodded slowly, chewing on the thought more than his food. Outside, a few members of the press had arrived. A local news van was parked across the street. Cameras stayed respectful, filming from a distance, capturing the soldiers, the vehicles, the significance of the moment. Social media was already alight with hashtags, hashtag Gracie's Diner Veteran, hashtag Silent Hero, hashtag Jack Spencer 101st. Inside, Jack finished his sandwich and folded his napkin neatly on the plate. "I've got a speech to write," he said suddenly. The colonel blinked. "For the school? For the kid? For his class? If they're going to listen to someone old, I better give them something worth hearing." "You've already done that," his son replied. Jack stood slowly, easing his stiff joints, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out the same small notepad. He scribbled something on the top line, then tucked it away again. As he made his way toward the door, the entire diner, every customer, every staff member, even the cook, rose to their feet. No one told them to. No one asked. It was instinct. Respect. Jack paused at the door and turned back for just a moment, his eyes sweeping over the room that had been his quiet refuge for years. He gave a small nod, then stepped outside into the light, where his legacy, at long last, was being seen. 3 days after the diner incident, Jack sat at the edge of his bed, slipping on polished boots that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. The early morning sun spilled through half-closed blinds, illuminating the small apartment lined with photos, many in black and white. A young soldier standing beside a chopper. A blurry shot of a group crouching in tall jungle grass. A folded flag in a wooden triangle case atop the bookshelf. Jack rose slowly, slipping into a tan field jacket, it seems faded but proud. In the pocket, the same notepad he'd written in after Gracie's. A simple line scribbled on the first page, "Tell them the truth, not the glory, but the cost." Colonel Spencer pulled up outside promptly at 7:30 a.m. in a government-issued SUV. He stepped out in casual uniform, not full dress. Today was about his father, not rank. Jack stepped outside, straight-backed as ever, and nodded. "Ready?" his son asked. Jack looked down at his boots, then at the rising sun. "As I'll ever be." The ride to the high school was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the soft rattle of metals in the glove box. As they pulled up, Jack noticed the line of students waiting to enter the auditorium. Some wore junior ROTC uniforms. Others wore jeans, hoodies, backpacks slung lazily over one shoulder. A few pointed toward the SUV, whispering. Inside, the gymnasium had been transformed. A podium stood front and center beneath a large screen that read, Veterans Week Honor Speaker, Jack J.R. Spencer, 101st Airborne. Folding chairs filled the space wall to wall. Teachers patrolled aisles. The principal, a balding, excitable man in his 50s, met them at the door. Colonel Spencer. Mr. Spencer. He extended a hand, almost tripping over himself. Thank you both. We're honored beyond words. The students are buzzing. We've never had a living legend visit, especially not one that's, well, gone viral. Jack chuckled softly. Don't let that viral stuff fool you. I'm still just the guy who eats turkey sandwiches every Thursday. The principal laughed a little too loudly, then quickly ushered them backstage. A tech crew helped Jack adjust a clip-on microphone, and one ROTC cadet, barely 17, full of nerves, handed him a glass of water. You nervous? The colonel asked. Jack shook his head. I've talked to dying men in the dirt. Teenagers can't scare me. At 8:15 sharp, the lights dimmed. The principal stepped onto the stage, cleared his throat, and gave a short but enthusiastic introduction. Applause erupted, not polite, but thunderous. Jack stepped into the light, slow but steady. He didn't fumble with notes. Didn't check the screen. Just stood there, alone and silent for a beat longer than most would dare. Then he spoke. I didn't come here today to tell you war stories. I've buried enough of those. I came to tell you what matters. The room was so still, you could hear someone unscrewing a water bottle in the third row. I joined the army when I was 17, Jack said. Not because I was brave, but because I was angry. My father died before I knew him. My mother worked herself to the bone. I figured jumping out of airplanes might make me worth something. He paused. It didn't. Not at first. He spoke of Korea. The freezing nights. The screams no one ever talks about. The friends he carried and the ones he couldn't. Then Vietnam, where silence was louder than bullets. Where medics worked with trembling hands and made impossible choices in red mud. I stitched people back together knowing they wouldn't survive the hour. Sometimes I lied to them, told them help was coming. Sometimes I just held their hand until it was over. No dramatics. No embellishment. Just truth, plain and clear. The students were riveted. Even the ones who usually dozed off during assemblies leaned forward. Jack continued, I didn't win wars. I didn't save the world. But I showed up. And when the time came, I didn't run. He looked out at them, eyes narrowing just slightly. You all are growing up in a world that tells you to speak louder, be angrier, scream for attention. But let me tell you something, quiet doesn't mean weak. Patience doesn't mean cowardice. I've seen men who never raised their voice command more respect than any general screaming orders. One of the teachers covered her mouth, overcome. A student in the front row wiped at his eyes. Jack set his water glass down. You'll forget most of what I said today. But remember this, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you live. Every damn day. He paused. Then, a half smile. And don't ever knock a man's cap off if you don't know what it cost him to earn it. The room burst into applause. Not forced, not formal, real. Standing ovation. Some students stayed clapping long after Jack stepped off the stage and returned behind the curtain. Backstage, the colonel handed him a folded slip of paper. That speech, he said quietly, was perfect. Jack raised an eyebrow. You didn't even hear the last half. Didn't have to. You said what needed saying. The principal returned, breathless. Mr. Spencer, we've got interview requests. News, local media, even a few national outlets. They want to do a segment, documentary style. About your service. About Gracie's. Jack considered it. Let me think on it. As they left the building, dozens of students waved, shouted thank yous. A few saluted. One young girl, no older than 13, approached with a sketch, Jack in his airborne cap, surrounded by parachutes and clouds. It was crude, charming, heartfelt. For you, she said. You're the first soldier I've ever met. Jack knelt, slowly, and took the drawing. Then I hope I didn't disappoint. The colonel drove them home in silence until Jack spoke up. Maybe it's time, he said. For what? Jack looked out the window, watching a flag flutter above a schoolyard. To stop hiding. To let people remember. Back at home, Jack placed the child's drawing on the mantel above the fireplace, carefully nudging aside an old photograph of his unit at Fort Campbell. The sketch didn't look like him, at least not the him he saw in the mirror, but it captured something purer. Not the man of war. Not the man of age. Just a symbol. He stood for a long time, hands folded behind his back, staring at it. Behind him, the colonel watched quietly, knowing better than to speak. There were things you didn't rush, grief, healing, pride. They had to move in their own time. Jack finally turned. It's in the closet. Top shelf. The colonel nodded and stepped into the bedroom. Jack hadn't opened that shelf in over 30 years. The box was still there, dusty, sealed with 2 lengths of duct tape so old it had yellowed into parchment. The colonel lifted it down like sacred cargo, setting it gently on the coffee table. Jack sat beside it. His hand hovered over the lid, then paused. "I thought about burning it once," he said. "But something told me I'd need it again." With deliberate care, he peeled back the brittle tape. The box opened with a soft groan of cardboard and history. Inside were layers. A folded uniform, the original one from Vietnam, still bearing the rank patches and mud-stained sleeves. His jump wings. Bronze star. A battered field journal with blood on the cover and half the pages torn out. A photo of 3 men, arms over each other's shoulders, all grinning like fools in the middle of a war zone. Only Jack remained. The colonel reached in and pulled out a small metal tin. "What's this?" Jack took it, cracked it open. Inside were dog tags, his own, and others. Each one belonged to someone who never came home. "They gave us extras," Jack said. "I kept the ones from the men I held at the end." He set them gently on the table, one by one, as if each deserved its own space. His hand lingered on one that read, "McKinney, Paul J." A long pause. "He was just 19, Jack said softly. "He asked me if it would hurt. I told him no." Jack wiped his eyes, not out of weakness, but reverence. "That was the first time I ever lied." They sat in silence, the colonel now realizing the weight his father had carried wasn't made of steel, it was made of ghosts. "I want to tell their stories," Jack said finally. "Not just mine. Theirs. They deserve that." "Then we do it right," the colonel replied. "We film it. Record it. Let schools, libraries, hell, even the VA, have it." Jack nodded, resolve building behind tired eyes. "But on one condition." "What's that?" "No dramatics. No flags waving in slow motion. No swelling music. Just truth." "Then that's exactly how we'll do it." That weekend, Jack opened his home to a small team of documentarians, veterans themselves, working on a series called Voices of Valor. The crew was lean, 1 cameraman, 1 sound tech, and a quiet producer named Rachel whose grandfather had served in Korea. She treated Jack not like a subject, but like an elder statesman. Over 2 days, they filmed in the apartment, at Gracie's diner, and on a walking trail where Jack often sat on a bench facing the river. He told them about being 18 in Korea, seeing a man die with his eyes open for the first time. About leaping into Da Nang under gunfire. About patching up friends while bullets cut through the air like invisible razors. He never raised his voice. Never choked up. But the pauses, those long, aching silences, said everything. "People think war is about bravery," Jack said during one interview. "But real bravery isn't charging a machine gun. It's living with what happened after." He spoke of McKinney, of the way he still dreamed about that jungle night. Of the guilt that clung like a second skin. "You carry them," Jack whispered, "even when there's no room left to carry anything else." One evening, after filming wrapped for the day, Rachel asked Jack if he wanted to record a personal message, something not for broadcast, but for his family. Jack hesitated. Then nodded. They set up the camera in the quiet of his living room. The light was dim. Jack sat with his cap in his lap. "If you're watching this," he began, "I'm probably gone. That's not sad. I had a good run. Longer than some, better than most. But there's something I need you to understand. I didn't live through those wars to be thanked or pitied. I lived through them so others wouldn't have to. If you forget what we did, that's fine. Just don't forget why we did it." He looked directly at the camera. "I hope I made you proud. And if I didn't say it often enough, I was proud of you." The camera blinked its red light once. Recording ended. 2 weeks later, the documentary premiered online. The segment on Jack Spencer was titled The Quiet Ones, and it opened with the scene from Gracie's diner, captured by a cell phone, where he calmly replaced his airborne cap and told the biker, "That's going to be a problem for you." Within 48 hours, it had over 3 million views. Within a week, it was picked up by national media. Veteran groups from every branch reposted the clip. High schools began asking for broadcast rights. Several local theaters in Texas played it before feature films as part of a Veterans Month initiative. Letters flooded Jack's mailbox. Children's drawings. Handwritten notes from fellow vets. A Navy chaplain sent a Bible with an inscription thanking Jack for his ministry of memory. Still, Jack didn't gloat. Didn't boast. He still went to Gracie's diner every Thursday. Still ordered the same turkey sandwich. Still left a generous tip and chatted with the waitress, who now called him Mr. Spencer, with a kind of reverent pride. One Thursday afternoon, as he stepped outside the diner, a young man in uniform waited beside the bench. He was maybe 23, army fatigues sharp, boots still clean. "Sir," he said, offering a sharp salute. "I'm Private Ethan McKinney. My grandfather was Paul McKinney. I saw your documentary. I wanted to thank you." Jack froze. Then his voice broke. He talked about wanting a family. "He never met me," the private said. "But because of you, he had a chance to start one." Jack sat on the bench slowly, nodding. "Then I guess that lie I told wasn't such a bad one after all." They sat together in silence. Two men. Two generations. One story. The winter that followed was mild by Texas standards, but Jack's health began to wane. At first it was just fatigue, longer naps, slower walks, a heaviness in his chest he dismissed as just old man dust settling. But the cough came next. Then the breathlessness. A doctor at the VA confirmed what Jack already suspected deep down: congestive heart failure. "It's a matter of time, Mr. Spencer," the doctor said gently. "Months, maybe. Not years." Jack nodded. He wasn't afraid. He had made peace with mortality long ago. But he wasn't done yet. With his remaining strength, he wrote. He filled pages in his notepad with names, moments, battles, and regrets. He met with schoolteachers, historians, even a local playwright who wanted to adapt The Quiet Ones for the stage. Every visitor left with more than they brought: a story, a lesson, a weight pressed gently into their hands. Colonel Spencer visited daily. No longer in uniform, just a son now, checking his father's meds, cooking breakfast, helping him into bed. But more than that, they talked. Really talked. Not about war, but about life. About Jack's wife, who had died 30 years earlier. About fishing trips that never happened. About how silence had built a wall between them they were only now tearing down. "You were a good father," Mark said one night as he adjusted Jack's pillows. Jack gave a tired smirk. "I was absent. You were present in the ways that mattered." Jack didn't reply, but his hand reached out and rested on his son's wrist. It said everything. The community, too, rallied. A rotation of guests began arriving at Gracie's diner every Thursday to hold Jack's seat. Veterans, teachers, ROTC cadets, even children would come, order his turkey sandwich, and sit in his booth, sharing stories or quietly paying respect. The staff started calling it Jack's Hour. One morning, Jack asked his son to take him somewhere. "Where to?" "The bench," Jack said. It was the same one by the river trail, the one he'd sat on during the documentary shoot. Mark drove him in silence. Jack didn't speak much anymore, his lungs too shallow. But when they arrived, and Mark helped him onto the bench, Jack leaned back, eyes closed, sun warming his face. "You see that tree?" he asked, pointing to a twisted oak just 20 feet away. "Took shelter under it once, back in '77. Tornado was touching down across the river. I hunkered there, waiting for the wind to pass. Thought that was the end." Mark looked at the tree. It was weathered, but sturdy. Still standing. Jack smiled faintly. Turns out, it was just the middle. They sat there for an hour. People passed, some waving, some stopping to quietly shake Jack's hand. A few left small gifts at his feet, an American flag pin, a rose, a handwritten letter from a child. Jack acknowledged each with a nod. As the sun began to dip, Jack whispered, "Let's go home." That night, Jack sat at his desk and opened his notepad one last time. He wrote just 3 lines. "For every man I left behind, I carried you forward. For everyone I saved, you carried me. And for those still fighting, hold the line." Then he closed the book. The following morning, Jack didn't wake up. He passed quietly in his sleep, hand resting on the notepad beside him, face turned toward the window. When the nurse found him, she didn't cry. She simply stood in silence, hand to her heart. Word spread fast. Within hours, news outlets were running obituaries. Not the kind filled with medals and statistics, but stories. Testimonials. Photos of Jack smiling beside students, sitting at Gracie's, speaking at assemblies. A wave of grief swept through San Antonio, and beyond. Colonel Spencer handled the arrangements with military precision and a son's heart. Jack would be buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery, per his request. No grandeur. No flyovers. Just a flag, a rifle salute, and silence. The morning of the funeral, the sky was overcast but calm. Hundreds attended. Veterans in full dress. Students in uniform. Children holding drawings of Jack with parachutes and folded flags. Gracie's diner closed for the day with a note on the door, "Gone, but never forgotten. Rest well, Mr. Spencer." At the cemetery, Jack's casket was draped in the American flag. It was carried by 6 soldiers from the 101st Airborne, handpicked by Colonel Spencer. Among them was Private Ethan McKinney, who requested to walk at the rear. The service was short. Colonel Spencer stepped forward to speak. "My father was not the loudest man in the room. He was not the most decorated. But he was the most honorable." He paused, voice steady but thick. "He believed in showing up. In doing the hard thing quietly. And in reminding us that respect is earned, not claimed. He didn't want a statue or a street named after him. He wanted remembrance. Not of himself, but of all those who never came home." He stepped down. A lone bugler played taps. The sound carried across the rows of white headstones like a prayer. After the flag was folded, it was handed to Colonel Spencer. He held it with both hands, then kneeled and placed it against his chest, eyes closed. That evening, the bench by the river trail was filled with flowers. Candles. Notes. Someone hung Jack's cap from the gnarled oak he once pointed out. And someone else, anonymous, left behind a small plaque, nailed gently to the bench. Jack J.R. Spencer. Paratrooper. Medic. Quiet giant. He took the hit and gave the lesson. In the days that followed, the Quiet Ones documentary surged again online, finding new life in schools, homes, and libraries. It was translated into 6 languages. Used in military orientation programs. Quoted by presidents. Studied in classrooms. But most of all, it lived on in the small acts. The man who bought coffee for the stranger in uniform, the child who saluted a vet outside the grocery store, the teenager who kept quiet when his friends mocked an elder in line. Jack Spencer had become more than a man. He had become a message. A reminder that dignity has weight. And silence has power. Still standing.